order. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I am the chair of the Budget Committee, Councillor Shelley Carroll. We do have quorum, including two virtual attendees of the Budget Committee. Deputy Mayor Morley and Councillor Chris Moyse are with us virtually. I want to welcome everyone and wish everyone a happy new year. Today's meeting is being held in person at City Hall in the newly upgraded Committee Room 1. We're calling this the Bridge. Lieutenant Zulu here to my left, Deanna Troy. The rest of you will have to submit your new names. Members, I want to call your attention to some of the committee room upgrades completed this fall, because it will help you in the meeting, and I dare say public deputants later on as well. You'll notice that we have an improved and different layout. It includes greater accessibility measures for mobility devices. There is a separation of the public gallery and new audiovisual equipment, including microphones, monitors, and screens. There have been significant acoustic improvements made to this room. So I would ask that everyone remember that now that we have perfect acoustics, side conversations really should happen outside the committee room. Your voices do carry, and I'm assuming that in a side conversation there may be an element of confidentiality. And if that's the case, you'll definitely want to step outside one of the doors of the room. If we can keep those to a minimum. Let's start our meeting in a good way by acknowledging that although we may be meeting in different locations today, the Budget Committee would like to acknowledge that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We'd also like to make an African ancestral acknowledgement. The City of Toronto acknowledges all treaty peoples, including those who came here as settlers, as migrants, either in this generation or in generations past, and those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. We pay tribute to those ancestors, therefore, of African origin and descent. So, are there, for this meeting, any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Seeing none, even virtually. Oh, we have another attendee. Welcome, Councillor Chernos Lynn. Okay, then we can proceed with the meeting. We do actually have minutes to confirm from way back when. Maybe, Mr. Vice Chair, I can get you to move that. We have the confirmation of the minutes of January 13th, 15th, 16th, and 17th of 2025. So and then moved. Our public speakers on the 21st, 22nd, 24th.
So moved.
Thank you. Moved by Councillor Perks. All in favour? Opposed? Seeing no opposed, that is carried. So, the purpose of today's meeting is to hear an overview presentation from the City Manager and this Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer on the 2026 operating and capital budgets. So happy to see that we have guests here beyond the Budget Committee. Today you're going to see the big overview from our leadership team. So before we give the presentation, I want to give a brief overview of what the process will be. And that is the following, that the Budget Committee will be responsible for hearing public presentations and providing advice to the Mayor on the operating and capital budgets after they've reviewed them. We'll be making our final recommendations to the Mayor at our meeting on Friday, January 23rd. So we have a lot to do between now and then. The detailed 2026 budget agenda, which includes all of the budget analyst notes, briefing notes, and supporting information from all the cities, agencies, and divisions, will be published later today. Understand late is now with a capital L, A little later than perhaps is ideal for you, but before you go to bed tonight, I promise that. It's going to be published on the clerk's website so that you can check on it later today. You'll find it at toronto.ca/council, and more information can be found, really the overview at toronto.ca/budget. And that's a page that you'll want to look at throughout the process, all the way until council adopts it. We're going to meet next on January 14th, 15th, and 16th to review the budget in more detail. So today, I hope that while we'll take a few questions if we have time before lunch, we want them to be on the presentation that you'll see today. I promise you, though, some of the burning questions I've heard thus far, they're in that presentation. I can promise you that. But members, if you need additional information from staff about this budget that you don't see covered by the presentations or the detailed notes once you've had a look at them, or from staff's answers in these meetings, you can request a briefing note by motion during the budget review meeting on January 14th to 16th. That's those 3 days that you're welcome to join us as we ask our questions. If you can, please send any motions for briefing notes as soon as possible. It really helps us to review them to where we see duplication. We can then collapse into one, those requests. And I ask that you give permission to the clerk to share the motions with financial planning so that they can do that work. Given the very short timeline between our budget review next week and our final wrap-up on the 23rd, financial planning staff will be under pressure. A lot of pressure to complete all briefing notes requested by the committee in time. So please give consideration of that narrow timeline when making a motion to request briefing notes. And if you're having trouble looking at, perhaps my answer is in these analyst notes, financial planning staff are happy to help you find it in analyst notes. Similarly, my office, we've gotten pretty good at looking at this stuff. So there's lots of help for you. We are scheduled to hear public speakers next week, Tuesday, January 20th and Wednesday, January 21st. And there are meeting sessions timed for 9:30 to 1:30 and then 6 p.m. at all of the Civic Center locations. Members of the public who wish to speak to the Budget Committee about the 2026 budget can register with the clerk at buc@toronto.ca and choose a meeting time on either the 20th or 21st to attend. And by that, we mean a time frame within one of those slots. Clerks can help you with that. The presentation we're about to hear is available on the clerk's website at toronto.ca/council. As soon as they begin to present, it'll go up on the website. Following the presentation, I'm going to open the floor and create a list of members' names for questions of staff before about the overview presentation. I want to thank city staff right off the top, particularly those in financial planning, for a lot of resilience and dedication that was needed. You've all seen the extraordinary outcome of this budget. It was not without a lot of work and dedication. Steve, Althea, I hope you will make sure that every member of your team knows how much we appreciate it. I've used this example in media. We set individualized targets to divisions. In some cases, they went back and forth doing whole redrafts of their budgets to try and get where they got. When I was receiving some of the notes, one of them came back saying version 9. And that was when it hit home for me how hard this work has been to get to the target set for each division. And just the process of doing the review to set their targets was really hard work done on behalf of financial planning. So I hope you'll listen with interest as they present today how they got to where we got and what it represents for the City of Toronto. I want to say that, I continue to emphasize for the community that while we have a low rate, there is still investment in this budget in the places where we know we need to invest. People had a close-up look at TTC yesterday. TTC Chair Jamal Myers is joining our committee now, and he's done the work on that big line. I've done the work on the other big line, the Toronto Police Service. So we're going to be able to delve into those when we get into the review days, 14th, 15th, and 16th. But it was real work on the part of financial planning to collaborate with some of these divisions, and those ones are great examples where there were pressures that couldn't be ignored to find, if not where those pressures lie, then where will you find efficiency? And so you're going to find when you go through the notes a really tough dive in, and the culmination of doing that for 3 straight years using this multi-year approach. And so without further ado, I want to turn this whole thing over to our CFO, and he can introduce his team as we go along. And Paul Johnson will remind us that it is all part of the long-term plan.
Well, good morning, Chair and members of the committee. It's great to be before you this morning.
Minutes.
Yeah, exactly. A $19 billion operating budget in less than 5 minutes. Excellent, excellent. And in the spirit of your Star Trek themed approach to this, I think given my hairline, Jean-Luc Picard would be more in line for me. So, thank you, everybody, and we appreciate the time this morning to take you through the overview of the Toronto 2026 budget. I, too, want to thank all the staff across our organization who have been involved in making this work. It is a team effort, but I do want to, as the chair has, single out leadership. We are all part of Team Toronto, but it does require leadership, and our CFO, Steve Conforti, and his team are the leaders of this process, and working very closely with yourself, Chair, as well as the Mayor, in producing what's before us today. And just to remind everybody here that what goes into this presentation this morning is, of course, the staff-prepared budget for 2026. It follows direction provided to myself and the CFO by the Mayor formally, which focused on affordability and the protection of key city services. It reflects our requirement to provide mandated and legislative services, as all municipalities are. It is consistent with the direction of Council regarding priorities and the overall City of Toronto strategic priorities, which remain in place as they have for many years. And it has been informed by public input that has happened in person and online through the fall. That will continue after today as well, but it's important to know that even today's presentation includes that public input. And at the end of the day, this represents a balanced operating budget, as we are required to develop. So, as we move to the first slide of the presentation, these are the highlights. The lead has been out there now for a number of hours. So at the end of the day, our budget in 2026 is supported by a combined 2.2% residential property tax increase. That is a combined factor of two things. One is a less than 1%, a 0.7% residential property tax increase to support our operating budget. And it maintains the 1.5% increase for the city building fund. I want to say right off the top that the courage that Toronto City Council took to put forward that over the next number of years, in fact, for an entire decade, that the investment in our capital side of the budget was an important piece of our work is to be commended. Steve will go into more detail in terms of how that is helping us to do what we need to do as a city, but I think it's also a signal to our other partners, particularly our government partners, about the commitment we are making here at the City of Toronto towards the capital side of our budget. You know, I'm a big fan of the old saying that you need to know where you're from, where you are, and where you're going. So on the next slide, I take us back a little bit to talk about the 2025 budget, because I think it's important for Torontonians to understand that each budget that we bring forward does include new approaches to the way we deliver services and targeted new services or improvements in services. And the same is true today. I've bucketed a few examples of that from 2025 in the 6 strategic priority areas of the City of Toronto. I'm asked actually a lot, does the City of Toronto have any priorities? Or do you just go day to day and figure stuff out? And the answer is, of course, we have hundreds of services that we deliver which are critically important, but we do focus on 6 things on a daily basis. 4 of those are very much external facing, and 2 of those are about how we run ourselves as the City of Toronto in partnership with you, our City Council. So let's talk about those 6 areas and reflect on what our budget in 2025 produced and look forward then to what 2026 brings. In terms of keeping Toronto moving, transit is at the heart of it, but it's not all about transit. But transit was a key piece. And in 2025, we were all thrilled that 3 levels of government came together to allow us to move forward with the purchase of new subway cars on Line 2 to make sure that our rides are more reliable and in keeping with a modern transit system. This is, yes, an intergovernmental win, and in the light of what's happening in our global economic situation, it has become even better, because this procurement will protect Ontario jobs, and it has increased the percentage of Canadian content within these vehicles as they are produced for the TTC. More hours have been provided to the TTC, and that is better for transit users. We have done a better and better job over the last few years of filling potholes. And you know, sometimes when I talk to Torontonians, they say, look, some of the core things we need the city to do is, for instance, fill potholes, whether you're driving, whether you're cycling, and in the case of sidewalk repair, whether you're a pedestrian, we need to make sure that those routes are safe. And we have increased over the last 2 years the number of potholes repaired. And the other piece that is really important in 2025 is we took the lessons from the acceleration of the completion of the elevated section of the Gardiner and have embedded that within all of our construction projects. What I think is important for people to celebrate is the fact that the Gardiner elevated section opened to all lanes of traffic about 18 months early. But what's more important to me is that those lessons are now part of how we do things. We want our construction projects in the city to be faster. We want them to be more reliable. When those dreaded yellow, orange signs go up that say, hey, we're going to do something in your neighborhood, we at least should have the courtesy to allow Torontonians to expect that when we say we are out by a certain date, we will be completed by that date. We're also finding ways to use the lessons learned from the Gardiner to accelerate projects such as longer working hours where that makes sense, and incentive-based procurement, which is now part of our general operating procedures. We invested in people in neighborhoods. A lot of this on the emergency services side of the house. Firefighters, police, and paramedics to respond to a growing city and to respond in as quick as possible fashion when people make that call that we all hope we don't need to make to 911. We've expanded libraries in hours in libraries and pools, which are important community assets. We're providing more meals than ever to children through expanded school food programs. And one of the really important pieces about making this city more affordable is there has been an increase in 2025 again of childcare spaces that are covered under the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Pact, which in Toronto means $22 a day for childcare. This can sometimes be the second biggest expense outside of housing that a family faces. And the more spaces we can provide at a reduced cost is good for Torontonians. We maintain and create housing that's affordable. 8,000 units of housing have been unlocked, and 6,000 rental units have been fast-tracked by cutting development fees. We have 3,800 families that have kept their housing through eviction prevention programs and our rent bank support, and another 1,660 families have been housed through housing benefits. This means that not only are we looking at building new, we're also finding ways for people to keep their housing, and that's good for Toronto. And when it comes to climate change and building resiliency, we have all sorts of programs that have helped people benefit through our basement protection flooding program and other ways that we're trying to mitigate the impacts of climate change now, but we're also making those important capital investments in the future so that we can be more resilient to the changes in climate. From an internal lens, I'm really proud to say that we have, in 2025, made some very significant improvements in how this city is run. It starts with the fact that when you want to build something in this city, it is not a little faster. It is tremendously faster due to the restructuring and reorganization of our work as a city administration. Our development application review timelines since the beginning of 24 are now 80% faster than those who experienced it prior to 2024. And what's great is that this team is not resting on its laurels. They're now looking at that backlog to try and clear it. We do know that some people have experienced years-long delays in their development applications, and we're trying to fix that and address that as we move forward. You challenged us as a council to continue to look at program reviews and use processes like lean to make sure that we are running as efficiently and effectively as we can as a city, and we took that to heart, and we've been doing it. We've already completed 6 of those processes, another 4 are underway, and in total, 15 critical city services will be part of lean process review. What does this unlock? Sometimes it unlocks savings, and that's great, but most times what it unlocks is it unlocks the ability for us to either provide better service that makes more sense for Torontonians, or that we can provide more service with the same resources, which in tight financial times makes all the difference. So I want to thank all of our staff who are working through that. And Chair, as you mentioned, financial sustainability really started in 2022 and 2023 with the work on our long-term financial plan, and I'm really pleased that we continue to implement that. So let's talk a little bit about that, because that is where we are today. We mentioned coming out of the long-term financial plan, which was presented to Council at a special Council meeting in 2023, that our movement towards a more sustainable future was a multi-year process. There was no way out of this in one budget and one budget cycle. It was going to take time. I'm proud to say that there are major portions of our long-term financial plan that are working, not the least of which is the opening budget pressures that you have experienced from 2024 through to today as we present the 2026 budget. It has come down dramatically, and that is a result of working through a variety of key issues related to our long-term financial plan. It's been a combination of staff finding ways to find real reductions in savings. And this year, Steve and I took the approach that when we talk about those reductions, instead of bundling it all together, we have teased out in each case the true ongoing sustained reductions. That is costs that have been removed from our operating as a City of Toronto, alongside some of the other offsets we do by prioritizing when and how we implement services. And I think that's a credit because, as you can see, it continues to be an improved process that we use each year to find those reductions. So I'm very proud of the work we're doing to implement the long-term financial plan. I'm very proud to be working with a council that has seen this as an important piece. We have more to do, and we are not there yet, but we are on a good track. So on the next slide, just a reminder of what we identified in 2023. This was one of the best reports I've been a part of, and it was also one of the scariest reports I've been a part of. It's good because, you know, hope is neither a plan nor a course of action. You need a plan. And so it came up with a plan. The downside is the enormity of the financial issues that Toronto experiences are vast. But I'm pleased to say with that plan, we have completed 35 actions within our long-term financial plan with your support. We've implemented new revenue and policy tools. We've identified billions in reductions and offsets. We've restructured some programs to make better use of our current economic situation and be more financially responsible. And we've limited new spending on programs that, quite frankly, we can't afford. That happens in areas, important areas like long-term care and some of the operation of our transit line. And it is not for a minute that we don't find those services important. It is that we need a new type of financial relationship in order to make sure that we can continue to expand those services. Now, a big part of what helped us, and it is a huge thank you that we need to continue to give, is the new deal with the province of Ontario has ensured that we can continue to work through our long-term financial plan. Some targeted investments by the federal government should not be overlooked, as they have helped us as well with certain elements on the capital side in particular, and on our operating side, most related to shelters and dealing with the influx of asylum seekers and refugees. So as we move to the next slide, I do want to say, though, that the challenges that Toronto continues to face are the same as they were a few years ago, and that's why we continue to work on what the plan is in order to deal with our realities. We, as a municipality, as all municipalities do, you know, we have a lot of the things that people experience each day. We have carriage of most of the assets that are in each of our communities, and yet in terms of the share of the overall taxpayer dollar, we are a minority player in that. What's worse is that some of those tools in terms of raising revenue that would be very helpful, the ones that grow over time, are just not what municipalities are given the tools to do. Most of ours do not grow with the economy. And in fact, Steve's going to take you through some more of those details as well. So from limited revenue tools to the fact that they don't grow with the economy, Toronto, like all municipalities, continues to face the need for us to work intergovernmentally to make this happen. What is good news is that we did, in what's called New Deal 1.0, commit together with the province of Ontario to review that 3-year initial commitment in 2026 so that we could be prepared for our 2027 budget. Just to close off with some of our key challenges in this year's budget, as I mentioned, we do have revenue risks. While we have to manage the increasing costs of labor, while we have to manage the increasing costs of good, we receive none of those benefits. So in terms of income taxes and sales taxes, those do not flow to the municipality, except in some of the rare occasions where we have some, like a municipal accommodation tax on hotels and short-term rentals. We continue to have some uncertainty in our intergovernmental funding, which we need to make sure continues to be a more permanent source of funding. Our expenditure pressures continue to be there, not only on growth and inflationary pieces, but in certain key areas that keep Toronto moving and keep us being the economic engine of the province and the country. And mainly that is around transit and some of our safety and emergency services pressures. Shelter and emergency services demands continue to be high in Toronto. We continue to provide far more service in that area than other municipalities. But I want to focus just for a minute on the fact that this is not a continuing grow part. In fact, as you dig into the budget, you'll see that our shelter services actually has a fairly significant reduction in its overall budget this year. Why is that? Well, our shelter system very ably dealt with the influx of refugee and asylum seekers, and those numbers are now down significantly from where they were a year to a year and a half ago. At one time, our shelter system saw over 6,500 refugee and asylum seekers within the system. Today, that number is just over 3,000, and we're very pleased that we've come to an agreement with the federal government moving forward about how we will both receive funding as well as change our operational structure to continue to have an appropriate sized part of our shelter system that is there to support those who flee their countries and end up in Toronto and end up in Canada. Our shelter system and our work in encampments is another thing that I want to focus on, because we are better today on January the 8th than we were on January the 8th in 2025 when it comes to encampments. And sometimes you wouldn't think that's the case, but let me give you the actual numbers. When we look at our parks, for instance, there are 48 parks in the city of Toronto today that have some level of an encampment. It could be one tent or one structure. It could be a few structures. 48 out of over 1,500 parks in the city of Toronto. Last year at this time, that number was 107. So you can do the math on the reduction there. In fact, when it comes to all the encampment structures in the city of Toronto, last year at this very time, as I was sitting here with Steve opening the budget presentation, there were 360 encampments. Today, that number is 170. We need to say thank you to the federal government, who did provide some 2-year, which is one-time funding over 2 years, to help us with our encampment outreach. It has allowed us to do more multiple pieces of work with people and help them move on. I also want to highlight that within our shelter system, last year alone, over 4,000 people were moved into permanent housing from our shelter system alone. Our capital challenges will be a focus this year within the budget, and Steve is going to spend some time recognizing that this is an area that continues to be a pressure for us, and one that, quite frankly, we're going to need a new approach. Akin to what we did on our operating budget side, we're going to need a new approach if we are to truly work through that. So I conclude with my part and then turn it over to the real numbers from Steve in terms of digging into the real numbers that are in part of the budget package by reminding everybody why Toronto matters. It isn't just ego about why we matter. It is the cold, hard facts of what we generate in terms of economic activity, not only in the province of Ontario, but across this country. We account for 1 in every 5 jobs in Ontario. We attract more than 20 million visitors annually who spend their resources and sustain businesses across this city. 26 million, let's get that straight. We have all sorts of reasons why When Toronto does well, the province and the country does well. And so when we talk about our shared responsibility, it is not because we just don't believe that we should be doing all the work. It is because Toronto, as Toronto goes, so does the province and so does the country. And at the bottom here lists just a few examples of where Toronto is a bit unique. And that is something that we continue to talk to our partners. Our intergovernmental partners very rarely hear from me about, why I need more help in terms of cutting the grass in our local park or picking up the garbage on a regular basis from our residents, because we as a municipality can manage that and handle it well. But when it comes to transit, when it comes to housing and shelter, when it comes to some of those unique features that are just different in Toronto, there isn't a pathway where our property taxpayers and our business taxpayers can sustain that. And if we can't have those vital services, we won't be able to drive the economic engine of the province and the country. So I thank you for allowing me a time to give a bit of an overview. And now over to Steve, who will take you through the details of our operating and capital budget.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And before I start, I'd like to extend my thanks to the Mayor, our Budget Chair, our Budget Committee members for your support in this year's process. I'd also like to take a moment to extend my thanks to staff across the organization that have supported this year's budget development. That, of course, includes all of financial planning, led by Althea Hutchinson, who has driven the budget process from day one, and all of our finance leads within city divisions and agencies who provided added guidance and supports to their respective teams. And lastly, I need to thank the team in my office, with special thanks to Lauren Birch and Cindy Williamson, who, along with Althea in financial planning, helped us get to this point today. So, buckle in, I got a few slides here. Today, we're launching the balanced 2026 operating budget. When we began developing this year's budget, we had two very clear directives from the Mayor. The first was to apply an affordability lens to all of the actions we undertook, be it consideration of tax rates and fees, or prioritizing investments and services that reduce financial burdens on Toronto households. And second, ensuring we did this while sustaining frontline services across the city. I know I say this a lot, but this was a very challenging budget process, where ultimately we were able to deliver on those two directives while at the same time making some added investments in areas we heard were most important to the public, including key investments in public safety through emergency services and support services, and investing in transit and transportation to keep Toronto moving. Over the next few slides, I'll provide some further details on how we built this year's budget, speak to some of the challenges we face that are both unique to the City of Toronto, but also those common to municipal finance in Ontario, and ultimately actions that have been taken with a continued multi-year lens to budgeting that enabled us to propose a 0.7% increase to the property tax levy specific to funding the operating budget. As we mentioned, we're presenting a total operating budget of $18.9 billion in gross expenditures. This reflects a $207 million or 1.1% increase from the final budget in 2025. The year-over-year increase is driven by three main factors. First, continued and added investment in our emergency services, paramedics, police, and fire, totaling $237 million. That includes impacts from our multi-year hiring plans with paramedics and police services. Second, $170 million towards our commitment to transit and continued prioritization investments in transit services, along with added costs associated with the operations of Line 5 and 6. And finally, we're experiencing further inflationary pressures to the cost of labor to deliver city services, beyond those reflected in emergency services and transit numbers. The final key driver was actually a reduction, similar to last year, where the federal and provincial flow-through funding increased our overall expenditures. This year, reductions in federal and provincial programs associated with childcare, shelter services, and Ontario Work supports that are provided by the city has resulted in a reduction of $276 million in total expenditures. Essentially, what this means is that through all of the actions to find reductions and offsets while not impacting service levels, we've essentially held expenditures flat, actually a slight decrease outside of key drivers I just noted. And this comes after also accounting for special one-time expenses like our delivery of FIFA World Cup and costs associated with executing in a municipal election. This slide shows the total gross expenditure and net budgets for 2026, with the full length of the bar depicting the total spend, and the lighter blue bars representing the amount of property tax funding dedicated to delivering those services. So we continue to spend a significant amount on the city's cost-shared social programs, with a total spend of $4.9 billion in 2026. This includes programs which are delivered by the city through contributions from other orders of government. That includes Toronto Employment and Social Services, Children's Services, shelter supports, housing, and it also includes long-term care homes and public health. I won't speak to all the categories, but I'll quickly note we now have more than $3 billion in total spending for transit services when including TTC and Wheel-Trans, which is the next major spending category after cost-shared programs. Next are rate programs, reflecting 12% of total investments, then police, budget with $1.7 billion in total spend. And finally, I'll also point out governance and corporate services and financing costs, which include expenses incurred on behalf of the entire organization, such as technology services and debt servicing costs. You've likely all heard me speak a lot about opening budget pressures. An opening budget pressure for a municipality essentially represents the difference between the expected cost to deliver city services in the following year compared to revenue we expect to generate. A constant in municipal finance, at least in Ontario, Canada, is that cost increases associated with inflation or added growth-related demands for city services will always outpace municipal revenue that are generally static in nature, resulting in an often significant opening budget pressure prior to any actions being taken to ultimately present a balanced budget. Historically, prior to the pandemic, we would experience about a $600 million opening pressure. That was challenging to address, but manageable. Over the course of 2020 to 2023, the city experienced average pressures of $2.1 billion associated with delivering key services during the pandemic, where we saw significant increases in demand for city services, while at the same time experienced diminished revenues like transit fares because of reduced ridership. From 2024 onward, there were no longer any COVID funding supports to assist municipalities with lasting impacts of the pandemic, resulting in much greater opening pressures than we had ever experienced. Following Council's adoption of the long-term financial plan, given the magnitude of the opening pressure and to avoid otherwise necessary reductions to critical city services, we introduced a multi-year strategy to transition these pressures in a way where we could do it over time and get our annual opening pressure back to a more manageable amount. In 2025, our strategy, coupled with provincial support from the New Deal, helped to reduce the pressure to $1.2 billion, with the expectation that it would be further reduced in 2026. As we approached the 2026 budget, we had an original outlook of $1.072 billion that was comprised of pressures from emergency and transit services, inflationary increases, prior year impacts, and the reversal of temporary bridging strategies that had been applied in 2025. With affordability concerns and weakening of the economy, balancing the budget with this pressure was going to be challenging. Following final budget submissions, the opening pressure actually increased by $268 million. This was from additional pressures that had not been anticipated in our original outlook that had been developed approximately a year ago. With a few to note, one of the most significant added pressures came from provincial changes to automated speed enforcement, where we can no longer expect to receive fine revenue to offset road safety and policing costs. Since 2021, we had experienced gradual increases in transit ridership as we inched closer to pre-pandemic ridership levels. However, in 2025, not only did we not see an increase in ridership and associated revenue, we actually saw a decline from the prior year, resulting in an added $39 million pressure expected in 2026 compared to our original outlook. And at the time of budget submission, we were still in discussions with the federal government related to supports for refugee claimants and asylum seekers, reflecting an added pressure to be addressed prior to finalizing the budget. What this means is we ultimately had to find $1.34 billion through reductions, offsets, and other actions to present a balanced budget for 2026. With an opening pressure of over $1.3 billion, the pressure had to be addressed through reduced expenditures, increased revenues, or a combination of the two. As it relates to increased revenues, like other municipalities, we have limited revenue options to balance the magnitude of pressures we face, with a heavy reliance on property tax revenue that, as mentioned, is relatively static on an annual basis outside of tax rate changes. While Toronto is the economic engine of Canada, nearly 90% of revenue tools available to us do not grow with the economy. And even the limited tools that do, like the land transfer tax, are experiencing softening. To emphasize our limited access to economic growth, when Taylor Swift was in Toronto back in 2024, it was estimated that her 6 concerts generated $282 million in economic benefit to the region, including $40 million in total government tax revenue. Of this, the only revenue that the city directly received that didn't offset added costs to support those concerts was additional MAT revenue, or municipal accommodation tax revenue, that we estimate was ultimately less than $500,000 beyond what we normally would have generated over that period of time. In comparison, other orders of government have access to tools such as sales tax and income taxes, which directly benefit from economic growth, so that when they experience additional costs, like those associated with inflation or population growth, unlike municipalities who respond with tax rate increases, they have the benefit of mitigating these costs through natural economic growth. For example, based on public StatsCan and Canada Income Survey data, the amount of income taxes paid by the average Toronto homeowner grew by $9,000 from 2015 to 2023. In comparison, during that same time period, the average amount of municipal property taxes in Toronto, following successive annual tax rate increases, grew by $914. The point here is that while municipalities had to specifically introduce tax rate increases to grow their tax revenue, other orders of government without any major changes in tax rates benefited from income tax paid growing 10 times more from the average Toronto household over the same period of time. This also holds true for sales tax. As an example, I just heard this week that the average price of a new car has risen by about $25,000 over the last 6 years. What this means is for every new car purchased in Toronto, the federal and provincial governments, without having to bring any annual changes to the HST rates, are generating more than $3,000 in added sales tax. I raise these 2 examples not to justify tax increases or changes to user fees, but because I think it's important to appreciate that when the City of Toronto faces budget pressures greater than those felt by many provinces in this country, we can only address those through increased revenue or reduced expenditures. The math of it all becoming increasingly more challenging every year when the inflationary pressure we face, like those associated with the cost of vehicles for our fleet, are not mitigated by economic impacts to the revenues we as a city generates. So, what does this all mean for the city? Here's an updated version of a slide that has been used in our budget consultation process and aims to provide a visual representation of the budget challenges we face in 2026. This large red tower that you see on the left of the graphic represents the final 2026 operating budget pressure of $1.34 billion. That much smaller green box just to the right of it reflects the $50 million in annual revenue that is generated from every 1% residential property tax increase. So, and only to provide perspective, to fully offset the opening pressure through a property tax change alone would have required 27% property tax increase. Now, the other towers that you see provide a to-scale visual of the 2025 portion of property tax funding that supports the major city services we provide. So alternatively, if we were to have approached the 2026 budget challenge of $1.34 billion through program reductions alone, we would have needed to eliminate expenses equivalent to all fire and paramedic services across the entire city, close all libraries, and remove all parks and recreation services across the city. And after that, we would still have to find an additional $33 million in reductions. So we obviously didn't take any of these actions, and I'll take you through the approach that we have taken to bring a balanced budget forward in 2026. As I noted, we ended with an adjusted pressure of $1.34 billion that needed to be addressed in order to present a balanced budget, while also ensuring we were following our direction to prioritize affordability in all of our actions and preserve frontline services. With that, similar to actions since the onset of our enhanced multi-year approach to budgeting, we started with identifying all possible reductions and offsets, ultimately identifying $788 million. This includes $135 million in actual reductions to budgeted expenditures in the form of efficiencies and detailed line-by-line reviews, as well as a further $653 million in offsets like cost deferral or avoidance, revenue adjustments, and other actions found through programs and fiscal reviews. Additionally, we explored, where appropriate, financing adjustments and available bridging strategies to provide further combined offset of $516 million. As I mentioned, we can balance a budget through expenditure reductions and/or revenue increases. All of these actions attempted to reduce the extent that we would rely on a property tax rate increase, which for this year we have aimed to minimize as much as possible with a 0.7% increase that generates $35 million in additional property tax revenue, which was taken as a last action to balance this year's budget. Give everyone a second. Okay. I want to share a bit more on what comprises the $788 million in reductions and offsets. First, as true reductions to the 2026 budget, we identified $57 million in efficiencies. These actions will result in permanent savings and are in addition to the $41 million identified last year. Efficiencies may include streamlining service delivery, reflecting improved purchasing or contract management, or automation to simplify administration. For 2026 specifically, this includes examples like the rationalization of technology services, like more effective license management, decommissioning of legacy solutions, and device management, resulting in over $5.2 million in identified savings within technology services budget alone. Across the organization, we've seen increased efforts to have greater insourcing to deliver services and programs in order to reduce reliance on contracted services and external consultants, like transportation services, where $1.9 million in savings was identified through these actions. And we see continued savings in areas such as the TTC and fleet services from the transition to electric vehicles, which results in reduced fuel costs. The 2026 budget also includes efficiencies in some of our agencies as they leverage corporate expertise and programs to reduce duplication of efforts, like the Parking Authority, who will benefit from the city's insurance and cybersecurity programs. In terms of line-by-line reviews, the 2026 budget includes $78 million in reductions as a result of detailed, targeted budget line reviews. This process examines historical spending, looking at cost categories and specific line items, to ensure the budget aligns with the latest projections and forecast needs. The budget restricts discretionary spending and allows the city to eliminate underutilized line items. Over the course of 3 years, the city's line-by-line review process has reduced the budget by over $350 million. Staff are also committed to continually identifying more efficiencies. For example, the establishment of the rolling program review will help divisions to realize more opportunities to streamline services, with actions continuing to take place in some key divisions this year. There are also new initiatives such as the Mayor's Budget Savings Challenge, which will enable frontline staff to submit ideas that can be implemented into real, tangible results for the city. In terms of budget offsets, after the budget submission, corporate and program staff collaborate to validate budget assumptions and estimates, providing a critical challenge function. This process considers the affordability of initiatives, verifies timing of cost assumptions, and factors in realistic ability and timing to deliver projects to ultimately align program scope with available funding. This year's budget incorporates $264 million from this process, which, in addition to the prioritization and deferral of costs, includes expected savings from the proposed continuation of a hiring slowdown for non-frontline positions throughout 2026. Staff will continue to review which positions will be included in the slowdown, with a lens on the impacts that delaying the hiring of those roles will have on frontline services. However, Budget Committee members and Council as a whole need to expect that this action will ultimately impact our capacity to support the delivery of some services and initiatives. The 2026 budget also includes $286 million in revenue adjustments. I've spoken so far about actions we have taken on the expenditure side, but we also review revenue assumptions and make adjustments based on projections and market trends. Revenue forecasts will get updated to reflect user fee changes, primarily from inflationary increases. For example, the 2026 budget includes $16 million from adjustments to user fees, which generally range from 2 to 5% increase, depending on the cost increases associated with those services. We've also included non-rate changes based on the latest and projected trends, like investment earnings, which are growing by $37 million. The 2026 budget also reflects adjustments to expected intergovernmental funding, like those for refugee and asylum supports and added costs associated with our paramedics hiring plan. And for this year, we have included an incremental $13.8 million in land transfer tax revenue from Council's adoption of an increased graduated rates on homes valued above $3 million. And not reflected in this number, but incorporated in our overall reductions and offsets, are the other adjustments like assessment growth, which reflects an increase in property tax revenue from changes in overall property values, usually due to new construction, renovations, or improvements, which this year is $76 million. And other program changes like reduced costs associated with the administration of the automated speed enforcement program. So that addresses the $788 million in reductions and offsets, but there were further actions that we took this year. The 2026 budget also includes $193 million in financing adjustments to optimize how we fund city programs and capital investments. This includes further aligning financing costs with the life of city assets, adjusting areas where we currently incur immediate operating expenses for a long-term asset, and instead, and more appropriately, treating these costs as a capital expense, with impacts to the operating budget over the term of the asset's life through debt servicing costs. We also have net savings within capital financing itself. Careful debt planning has allowed us to reduce our operating pressure by reviewing our debt servicing costs with a greater portion of costs associated with recoverable debt rather than tax-supported debt, thereby reducing costs to the property tax base. The budget also benefits from the growth that we've seen in our capital levies beyond initial expectations. In 2026, the City Building Fund will generate about $460 million in revenue to fund critical capital investments in transit and housing. This is greater than what we had expected to generate from earlier modeling done 5 years ago, with the increase driven by higher levels of assessment growth and inflation rates compared to what was originally anticipated. Just give it a second. As a result, we've been able to both consolidate capital levies as well as increase our annual allocation available to Scarborough Transit initiatives like the Eglinton East LRT by 10%, while at the same time reducing pressures on our general operating levy. And as Paul's mentioned, in 2024, the city's long-term credit rating was upgraded for the first time in 2 decades to AA+, which has supported stronger demand for city bonds and led to borrowing cost savings. While all of these actions have had a significant impact on our pressures, similar to last year's budget, we also applied $323 million in temporary bridging actions, which are short-term or one-time actions to balance the budget. This includes a drawdown of the remaining balance in the budget bridging reserve. We also look to maximize the use of other city reserves, where we conducted a comprehensive review of inactive and underutilized accounts. Lastly, staff initiated actions late last year with the aim of generating a 2025 surplus to be leveraged against 2026 pressures. Ultimately, these funding changes and temporary measures to help balance the budget while maintaining services. However, I do want to note that as these actions are available on a one-time basis, they will create an equivalent pressure as part of the opening budget challenges reflected in our 2027 outlook. Okay. While we've taken all the actions noted to bring a balanced budget, a directive for us as well, as we developed the 2026 budget, was to ensure we were advancing affordability and preserving city services. Our 2026 budget maintains services while also making modest enhancements in the areas that we heard are the most important to our residents. This slide shows just a few select examples of key investments within our nearly $19 billion total operating budget in the areas of making life affordable. The budget includes funding for school programs, which will reach 757 school communities and camps, which will now be expanded to 155 new communities or 62,000 additional students, and to 89 more camp locations and more than double to support 60 new camp participants. Getting Toronto moving better. We will now have 127 traffic agents, 27 more than we had last year, which will continue to help improve travel times in key corridors. And new fare capping on the TTC will also help to create 2.1 million net new free rides, which also supports making life more affordable for transit riders. To deliver a safer Toronto for everyone, we are continuing to invest in emergency services with 258 added positions between police and paramedic services above the existing 9,459 positions we have today across our emergency services, while at the same time investing in social and crisis supports at more library branches and enhancing Toronto community crisis services across our transit system. We're also rolling out color-coded rent-safe ratings to 3,600 buildings to ensure they remain safe. And finally, we've also focused on providing excellent community services. In 2025, we had 83 library branches open 7 days a week. That will be expanded to a total of 100 library branches this year, which reflects Phase 3 of the open hours vision. We provided 489 portable air conditioning units to low-income seniors with health needs. The 2026 budget includes enhanced funding to provide at least 1,000 AC units this year. And lastly, I do want to note that the budget includes $2 million in added funding for service enhancements that have not yet been allocated. These funds will be made available to the Mayor for inclusion in her proposed budget following public input and feedback heard over the next month's process. Advancing financial sustainability for the city while preserving critical city services requires us to continue to develop our budget through a multi-year approach. Our current estimated opening pressure for 2027 is approximately $1.1 billion, which includes the reversal of our 2026 bridging strategies, as well as full-year costs for 2026 enhancements and expected growth and inflationary pressures. This means, absent any new or unforeseen added pressures, the 2027 budget will continue to face challenges and will need to be balanced within our multi-year plan through the phased reversal of temporary bridging strategies, the continued identification of additional annual offsets and reductions with an expectation of finding at least 990 Okay. Is everyone still with me? Yep. All right. We'll now get into the capital plan.
I was just about to say, you better get into capital. I'm watching the clock.
The 10-year capital plan totals $63.1 billion with $5.3 billion in spending in 2026 alone. In our capital plans, investing in state of repair continues to be a priority, with $33 billion or 53% allocated to maintaining city assets. Over the next few slides, I'll speak to some of our key capital assets within an asset inventory that totals over $200 billion and makes a point of highlighting investments that we're making in infrastructure that make life more affordable, keeping Toronto moving, and delivers a safer Toronto for everyone and supports our delivery of community services. After that, I'll also take a moment, and maybe a bit more than that, to provide some details on the City Building Fund and the 1.5% tax increase that will continue to be directed to transit and housing infrastructure, our investments in growth-enabling assets and the challenges faced there with declining annual development charge revenue, and lastly, the current state and challenges associated with our needs to ensure investments in maintaining our existing assets in a state of good repair. So briefly, the 10-year gross capital plan is $63.1 billion. This is an increase of $3.5 billion over last year's 10-year plan, or 6%, and almost doubles the capital plan from just 10 years ago in 2016, which speaks both to our growing capital demands, but also how we have prioritized capital investments in the city. We've continued to grow our capital plan with focus on advancing key projects in water, housing, and state of good repair while ensuring the plan remains affordable and achievable. The capital plan of $63 billion will support key investments to purchase, build, maintain, and repair city infrastructure. Looking at key investments in this chart, $18.6 billion, or 28% of our capital plan, is directed to water and wastewater infrastructure, including added investments in sewer rehabilitation and water treatment facilities, which is predominantly supported through water rate revenue and planned annual rate increases and has no reliance on tax-based funding sources. The city's highest investment of tax-based funding is in transit. At over $17 billion, this represents 26% of the total capital plan, with significant investments in expanding the capacity and reliability of our transit system. The city is also committed to spending over $5 billion in housing, which includes investments in TCHC buildings, coupled with further $3.6 billion in incentives, which I'll get into in a bit more detail in the next slide. We're also investing a further $6.6 billion in transportation through investments in areas like roads and bridge repairs. And the city will also spend $5.5 billion on environment and recreation initiatives that include investments within parks, waterfront revitalization, environment, climate, and forestry, as well as the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority. You're going to hear more about all of these investments next week when you receive presentations from service areas and agencies. However, I'll share a few highlights. I mentioned the city currently has over $200 billion in assets. Included in that are almost 56,000 public housing units operated by TCHC and TSHC, as well as 32 facilities operated by Toronto Shelter and Support Services and 39 child care centers operated by Children's Services. The 2026 capital plan makes significant investments in the goal of making life more affordable, including $1.9 billion in critical repairs and upgrades to our public housing units, and $1.4 billion in direct funding for city rental projects to support 65,000 affordable homes. The plan invests $950 million in homeless infrastructure, including integration of long-term care, supporting housing and community hubs, and $92 million towards infrastructure that will support child care services. In addition, the city will provide $3.6 billion in financial incentives to advance over 31,000 new homes, including 22,800 affordable and 8,600 rent-controlled homes. This includes an average of $114,000 in incentives or foregone revenue for the city per unit, generally comprised of reductions or waivers to development charges, property taxes, community benefit charges, parkland, and planning fees to support the city in meeting its housing goals. The city also maintains over 70 kilometers of subway track and 143 trains, almost 1,900 buses and 173 bus routes, 258 streetcars, 5,600 kilometers of roads, and 900 bridges and culverts to keep Toronto moving. The 2026 capital plan includes $10.4 billion to upgrade the city's subway system, including $3 billion in subway train purchases, plus capacity enhancements, vehicle overhauls, and improved signaling, and $2.7 billion to modernize and purchase new buses, in addition to $1.3 billion in investments in streetcars and other system upgrades. The capital plan also includes $4.5 billion dedicated to the rehabilitation and maintenance of our road network, including major and local roads and bridges, and $1.2 billion for growth-enabling infrastructure like road widening and extensions. Toronto maintains the largest municipal emergency services in Canada, which relies on 40 police buildings, 1,975 police vehicles, over 45 ambulance stations, 243 ambulance, 84 fire stations, and 196 heavy vehicles such as fire trucks. The 10-year capital plan invests $554 million in ensuring police facilities are maintained in a state of good repair and to support long-term plans for 4 police divisions, and also invests $340 million in paramedic equipment and multifunction ambulance stations, including $96 million in new funding for a 23,000 square foot paramedic hub, which will combine ambulance bays, logistics, admin, and training to centralize paramedic operations and improve efficiencies. There's also $41 million apiece allocated to ambulance and fire services equipment. And the largest area of investment in the city's capital program, the city invests in maintaining 6,100 kilometers of water mains and more than 10,500 kilometers of sewers. To provide excellent community service, the city also has 127 community centers, 126 rinks, over 200 aquatic assets, and 10 supervised beaches, as well as 1,500 parks. The capital plan invests $8.2 billion in water treatment, $3.8 billion for water infrastructure such as water main replacement and rehabilitation, and $5 billion in stormwater management, including basement flooding protection. The plan also includes $2.1 billion for 12 new community recreation centers, aligned with Parks and Rec's facility master plan, and the rehabilitation of 9 others, along with upgrades to 125 public washrooms. The capital plan for Parks and Recreation also includes $538 million for upgrades to arenas and ice rinks and 33 indoor and outdoor pools. Finally, there's a further $748 million allocated to park acquisitions and development. To support the capital program and consistent with Council's previous endorsements, there's a 1.5% levy increase dedicated to the City Building Fund in 2026. The continued growth of the City Building Fund until 2035 remains critical in supporting priority housing and transit projects. In 2026, the rate increase will result in an incremental revenue of $75 million and total revenue this year of $459 million. The City Building Fund is expected and required to grow to $1.3 billion annually by 2035 in order to support existing capital commitments. To date, we've already spent or committed to $2.3 billion in investments from prior year budgets, and the 2026 capital plan includes $8.7 billion in further planned capital investments in transit and housing that would be supported by the City Building Fund. We have also ensured there is capacity remaining within our City Building Fund to support the city's contribution to future projects, such as Council's approved city commitment of $1.2 billion towards the Eglinton East LRT and the city's share towards Waterfront East Rapid Transit. And lastly, we continue to work with our colleagues at the TTC and other various housing-related programs to review and prioritize added, currently unfunded needs that can be ultimately uplifted and included in later future year capital plans. In terms of other funding tools to support capital investments, development charges are one-time fees that developers pay to municipalities to help fund critical growth-enabling infrastructure. This is either infrastructure needed to enable housing development like sewers or roads, or infrastructure needed to support communities that move into those developments like transit or parks. It's often pointed out that the city has over $2.5 billion in our DC reserves to support this work. The challenge is that we have $6.7 in approved DC funding commitments for growth-enabling infrastructure that rely on the current reserve balances as well as the need for future DC revenue. Our reality is that our current level of DC revenue is insufficient for our existing commitments. I'm often asked about our DC reserve balances, and I like to explain that the balances through an examination of 4 different periods of development activity. When we consider average annual DC revenue collected between 2014 and 2017, we received about $240 million per year, and we spent about that much in DC funding towards growth-enabling infrastructure. Then from 2018 to 2023, the city experienced a bit of a development boom, with average annual DC funds at about $730 million coming in at a faster pace than the city was able to deliver new infrastructure. This resulted in the growth seen in our DC reserve. In 2024, this changed. Due to a market slowdown across the entire housing spectrum, with less housing starts and sales, resulting in decreased development activity and revenue, with now $380 million in DC collected, this was the first time in a few years that our DC spending outpaced the DCs we collected, and our reserve began to decrease. In 2025, we're seeing that trend worsened, with $137 million in projected DC revenue that year, far lower than the average annual need of about $600 million included in our capital plan. The difference now is that these decreases reflect both the market slowdown, but also the initial impact of recent provincial legislative changes like Bill 17. Bill 17 has changed the timing of payments of DCs from building permit to occupancy, which means that while the city will still collect DC revenue, on average, it will come in 3 to 4 years later than previously expected. With the Bill 17 change that defers collection of DC revenues by 3 to 4 years, coupled with our current market slowdown, it's reasonable to expect significantly less DC revenue to be collected over the next 6 years. In fact, we estimate that Bill 17 alone will defer $1.9 billion in DC revenue we expected to receive in the next 10 years to beyond our current capital planning period. What all this means is that we are now going to see the reserve funds slowly whittled down and spending outpace revenue coming in. Ultimately, when considering all of these factors, the current level of DC fund revenue is not sufficient to support approved and planned growth-enabling capital investments. As a result, we've had to make immediate reductions of almost $300 million to our capital plan in areas of recreation, libraries, and waste. Unfortunately, this is not a one-time issue. We will need to keep monitoring the amount of revenue coming in and expect further reductions or deferrals that will be needed in the budget next year, in particular in areas of water and road. I mentioned that our investments in state of good repair continue to be a capital priority, which is demonstrated by the $33 billion invested in this year's capital plan, an increase of almost $900 million or 3% over last year. This includes investments in cities' essential infrastructure, including the transit system, housing stock, recreation, and other community facilities. The city continues to face significant pressures in terms of SOGR needs, with over $200 billion in existing assets to maintain, many of which have updated assessments, are approaching the end of their useful life, and with investments in new assets, which will also need to be maintained, is increasingly challenging to meet our SOGR needs. I think it's important that I speak to SOGR needs after the DC slide. When municipalities are asked to further leverage tax-supported debt rather than DC funding for growth-enabling infrastructure, it has two direct impacts on municipalities' SOGR backlog. First, every added tax dollar we apply to growth-enabling infrastructure is one less tax dollar available to address our critical and escalating SOGR needs. Second, every dollar used to build new infrastructure also adds to assets that we are then responsible to maintain, ultimately adding to our SOGR needs. I think it's important that this dynamic is understood when we have DC conversations, because municipalities are responsible for 60% of public assets. Many of these assets that were built in the 60s and 70s and are coming to the end of their useful lives. At the same time, municipalities only collect about 9% of all government taxes and fees. So to borrow a line I hear at times from the development industry, the ability to ultimately address our SOGR needs just doesn't pencil. I am particularly proud of the actions the city has taken over the last few years to prioritize SOGR investments. We've been able to significantly grow our investments in SOGR. This has been possible through council commitments to growing the city's building fund, our enhanced corporate asset management plan, development of capital prioritization frameworks. As I mentioned last year, not only did we eliminate the city's single largest SOGR liability in the upload of the Gardner, we also redirected those freed up funds to critical SOGR needs in transit, our roads and bridges, TCHC, city buildings, and our parks and rec facilities. The issue is that SOGR needs are beyond the financial reach of municipalities, and a sustained all-of-government approach to invest in existing public infrastructure is needed. And here in Toronto, we would welcome stimulus or infrastructure programs that can stack onto the $33 billion that we already invest in SOGR, including the considerable gains that we've made over the last few years alone. So I don't want to stay on this slide for too long, but it does show what all of these actions we have taken do to bring down our SOGR needs. Since 2024, we continue to see added pressures through the 2026 budget process, primarily due to impacts identified through reassessment of SOGR needs in areas like transit services and community housing, the impacts of new assets coming online adding to future SOGR needs, and inflationary increases to the cost of construction, impacting the reach of each tax dollar invested in SOGR. To hopefully end on a positive, even with the challenges I noted, the 2026 trajectory is improved from 2024. The impact is due to the significant and sustained level of investments we have made in the past few capital plans and will continue to make through future capital planning processes. Okay, I promise I am in the last section now, property tax and rate impacts. We have shared the 2026 budget incorporates a total residential property tax rate of 2.2%, including 0.7% in support of the city's operating budget, as well as 1.5% increase for the city building fund. This results in total annual increases of $92 or $7.63 a month for the average home, which has an assessed value of just over $692,000. And just to clarify, the current assessed value for all residential properties in the city that is used for property tax purposes is accurate at $692,000. It does differ from the average sale price of a home in Toronto because the assessed value based on property valuations conducted in 2016, which is the most recent assessment by the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation for municipalities in Ontario. And before I get asked, we still do not have an update on whether an assessment will reoccur this year. So in terms of residential, property taxes, the city maintains property tax relief programs, including the tax increase deferral program and tax increase cancellation programs. In 2025, these programs benefited approximately 10,500 households, and in 2026 will be available for eligible residents whose household's income is $62,000 or less. For multi-residential properties, the budget reflects a property tax increase of 1.1%, which includes 0.35% to support operating and 0.75% for the City Building Fund, which is half of the residential rate, and takes into consideration the provincial rent guidelines consistent with our annual approach. Last year, we introduced a new multi-residential subclass that is available to all new multi-residential developments to incentivize added housing supply and provide a 15% reduction from the current new multi-residential rate for a period of 35 years. The operating budget also reflects a total increase of 1.1% for commercial properties, again, which is half of our residential increase, consistent with provincial regulations related to tax ratios. Since 2022, the city has maintained a small business property tax subclass, which provides a 15% rate reduction for eligible properties. This program currently benefits over 28,000 small businesses, or 63% of all commercial properties in Toronto. And finally, there is a planned combined 2.2% increase for industrial properties consistent with the residential rate. Back in December, City Council approved an interim rate increase of 3.75% for both Toronto Water and solid waste, which included water and wastewater consumption rates and solid waste rates and fees. The prepared budget before you today confirms those rates with no changes to 3.75%. This will result in an average annual household increase of $40 based on 230 cubic meters of water consumed, and it will result in an average increase of $11 to $22 for a single-family home, depending on the size of their garbage bin. When combining the rate increase with the property tax increases, this would result in a total impact of $146 to the average home, assuming a medium-sized bin. This reflects impacts for residential customers. However, I do want to note this year, Council adopted a phase-in approach to increase the current 30% discount for high-volume industrial Block 2 consumers to 35% over the next 3 years, which means in 2026, Block 2 customers will see a 1.25% rate increase rather than 3.75%. All right, before I wrap up, I'll just take a moment to go over the upcoming schedule. Today is the first official day, but the budget process was begun many months ago, starting in early summer months before with various public consultation opportunities. Looking ahead to next week, the city will, for the third year now, be hosting telephone town halls, providing more opportunities for residents to call in and participate in the budget process. These will happen in the evenings of January 14th and 15th. Also next week, from January 14th to 16th, the committee will receive presentations from service areas and key agencies. On January 20th and 21st, there will be another opportunity for the public to participate through deputations to Budget Committee. On January 23rd, we'll have a wrap-up of Budget Committee to review any further budget materials and questions. Then there will be a special council meeting on February 10th to discuss the budget following the mayor's release of her proposed budget by February 1st. We really do encourage people to get involved in the budget process. It was great to meet everyone that came out to the fall pre-budget consultations across the city. However, there are still opportunities to hear feedback and input from residents and businesses that include the telephone town halls I just mentioned, speaking to Budget Committee on January 21st and 22nd, through written feedback to Budget Committee, or as you can always contact your local councillor. Our team is often invited to support various town halls across the city, and I'm sure Althea and our team would be happy to continue to provide that support. So with that, thank you very much to our budget chair, our budget committee members for your time this morning, and we look forward to continued discussions over the next month in support of the 2026 budget.
Thank you very much. I will point out, too, because I know there are councillors that are just watching and listening in their office. If you go into the presentation online, which should be up on Timus now, there's an appendices to the presentation that are slides that finance staff thought would be particularly useful in your budget town halls. So people should definitely take a look at those slides. You'll find them helpful. I'm going to add just in case, one more person to my list. Welcome, Councillor Crisanti. Okay, so maybe we should do it right now before we go any further. We're almost at 12:30, and I know people want to ask a few questions of the presentation, so they have, they're teed up. So I'm wondering if we could move a motion. Is the will of the body that we extend to finish? I see the Vice Chair is joining me in that motion. All in favor of extending to finish and taking a round of questions? Perfect. Okay, thank you, members that are virtual. I'm going to go to non-members first. I have Councillor Thompson. Councillor Fletcher may be returning. We're on questions now. I know Councillor Fletcher was listening in her office. Councillor Thompson, will you have questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Councillor Chernos-Lynn, Councillor Crisanti, will you have questions?
I may have one or two small ones.
Okay, I've got you down, Thompson, Chernos-Lynn, Crisanti, and I'll wait to see if Councillor Fletcher's coming in. And members, I'll do a numbered list once we bring it into committee. So, Councillor Thompson, why don't you kick it off?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair, through you to staff. Thank you for the excellent presentation. This is my 23rd budget, so I've seen it grow a long way, but I've seen so many similarities, quite frankly. So as much has changed, not enough has changed. That's just a preamble. I wanted to understand Section 37 piece, and maybe I'll just throw all my questions in and you can answer them in that way. Section 37, we've seen the changes with respect to the CBC. Wanted to understand what the impact to this budget is as it relates to the sort of magnitude of those numbers, which would be far less than what we would realize with respect to Section 37. So that's one. The other thing I wanted to understand, with respect to the 100 new officers that are helping with respect to traffic flow, how do we measure the benefits of that? And we are creating an expenditure, we have salaries and so on. Does that actually help with respect? Have you measured the benefits in terms of easier access, less congestion, people getting home sooner, better utilization of time? And then my final question, with respect to areas like Vaughan, which are eliminating DCs and so on, and you've explained the challenges we have with respect to the DCs and the comparators, because people always compare Toronto and say, well, Vaughan's reducing or eliminating their DCs, why can't we do the same? I'm just wondering, how are they able to realize a reduction? And we're saying that we're challenged. In fact, we're looking at either stabilizing, maintaining, and or increasing. Those are the three questions I have.
Okay, thank you. Mr. CFO.
Thanks. So to the chair, and I'll start with the first and third, and the second question as it relates to the traffic wardens. That may be better suited next week when Transportation Services is here and being able to measure that in more detail. In terms of the first question, so there was a change in terms of Section 37 and the shift to community benefit charges. At the time, we had anticipated that change was likely going to mean a reduction in annual what would have been Section 37 revenues of, I think it was about $50 to $70 million a year. So that is starting to manifest. We have included, and you do see within various materials, how much CBCs we begin to collect. And we've talked about the process in terms of how those get applied and working with the local councillors to ensure that they're being applied to critical growth-enabling capital work within the wards, but it's generally a loss of about $50 to $70 million annually compared to the previous Section 37 approach. As it relates to development charges itself, there are differences when you look at, one, how DCs are used, how they're collected, what they're collected for across various municipalities. I think if we were to speak to Vaughan specifically, and I am by no means an expert in Vaughan's finances, I think the first answer there is a different dynamic because they are a two-tier municipality rather than the City of Toronto. So when they collect development charges, there's both the regional rates that are being collected for infrastructure and the municipal, versus here in the City of Toronto, the DCs that we collect are entirely for the city. And I also say in the City of Toronto, we're very different than many other municipalities. When you look at what we collect DCs for, it's actually predominantly transit here in the city. Off memory, I think our DCs, about 42% of all the DCs that we collect are to be able to enable us to make the investments we need in transit to deal with the growth that we see in our city. It's almost the complete inverse that you see outside of Toronto. where their major portion is for water mains. Very different in the City of Toronto, where much of our development is infill. We already have existing water mains. It's still about 12% of our DCs, but not to the same extent. The other major change that I've seen other municipalities do that have reduced their DCs beyond what the incentives and the actions Toronto has taken itself is they've leveraged some of the federal and provincial funding programs that were directed to them. The city has made a decision to leverage those funding programs to be able to support additional housing development on top of the actions that we've been taking as it relates to our development charges themselves.
Okay, thank you. I have... Yes, we run their subway for them. Councillor Chernos-Lynn, did you want to go next?
Sure. Can you hear me?
We can. We can hear you quite well in our new, up here on the bridge. We can hear everything. The acoustics are a little too good.
Not to speak too loud then. I guess I have a couple questions. One was whether we realized any savings or whether there was any impact whatsoever one way or the other from the federal government's cancellation of the carbon tax rebate.
To the chair, we do, and it's in my binder. I will have to find exactly where it is off memory.
Councillor Chernos-Lynn, I'm going to be pretty tough with people, especially as we're running late, to stick to the presentation. That is a great question, but I think having posed it, I think to be fair, we'll let finance staff bring that answer to us in the 14th to the 16th detailed review.
That's fine. I just want to put it out there. I'd like information on that.
Yeah.
With respect to the presentation, I had another two questions. One was with respect to user fees. Mr. Conforti, you talked about, I don't remember if it was you or actually if it was the city manager who talked about user fees going up 2 to 5%, but you didn't give any examples. And I just wondered if you could provide us with a little bit more meat about that, I guess.
Sure. So as part of our user fee process, we will look at all of the user fees that we have across all of our city divisions. Our user fee policy looks at maintaining the level of cost recovery. And to be able to do that, we will look at the inflationary increases associated with those services. And that could differ depending on the service and the inputs into delivering that. What we will then do is apply an inflationary increase equivalent to that cost. What you see across the city is, be it user fees in our planning and development areas and our recreation areas, or across any area in the city where we have pay for service, we would take that same approach to our user fees. And generally, outside of a few exceptions, you would see a 2 to 5% increase.
Okay. I'll be looking for more information probably as we go through on that. My last question, and maybe I missed some of the details. I was trying to write down as much information as possible as you were going through the presentation, and I'll certainly go through it again. But with the loss of revenue from the automated ticket enforcement program, we are still committed, obviously, to trying to create, safer road configuration in line with Vision Zero and all of that. And the Premier has talked extensively about how there are alternatives that we can use. Some work, some don't in the City of Toronto context. But I'm wondering if there's funding coming from the province around that, or if that's really comes now back to us as our baseline.
To the chair, there is funding. So the budget does include the province had announced the funding program, which was going to be provided to municipalities to be able to offset some of the impacts that they had, and especially where we reinvested those funds in road safety measures. So the budget in front of you today does show the change in expected revenue associated with ASE. It also shows the decrease in some of our costs associated with administering that service, and then the delta between the two are generally being offset by provincial funding.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. That's it for me, Councillor Carroll.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor Crisanti, and just so that people know that there is the detailed presentation is now up online. I just checked to make sure it's there on Timis under the Budget Committee agenda. Councillor Crisanti, you had some questions?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. Stephen, you made reference earlier in your presentation to the 1.5% levy. And this levy, so a couple of things. Can you just, to clarify for everyone, when was this levy initiated? Does this levy have an end date? And what is the current balance of this levy today as we speak?
To the chair, so I assume you're speaking to the City Building Fund levy. The City Building Fund levy was introduced. So the levy in terms of the City Building Fund itself was first introduced in 2017 as initially a 0.5% increase. It was originally expected over 5 years. I believe in the 2020 budget process, it was extended. It was then also extended again to continue until the year 2035 with successive 1.5% annual rate increases. In terms of the reserve balance today, so there is, I'll have to confirm the exact amount. I believe it's about $1 billion in the reserve today, which it's the way the reserve is used, I think is an important point to stress. Essentially, the funds are generated from the City Building Fund. They get placed into the reserve, and then the reserve is leveraged to pay the debt servicing costs associated with the projects that have been funded from the City Building Fund. So by design, that reserve will continue to grow until 2035, at which point it will begin to be depleted over the next 30 years as it fully services the debt that has been issued against the fund.
So you're saying the end date is 2035 for the levy?
The end date in the increases is 2035 for the levy. The levy itself will then be static and continue.
All right. And is there, when you put this budget together, and I know that you've had to dip in certain reserve funds throughout the process to come up with the increase of 2.2%, including the 1.5%. You didn't, did you need to dip into this reserve fund? Just wondering which reserve funds we actually dipped into.
Sorry, the City Building Fund Reserve Fund?
Yes.
So we always draw from the City Building Fund Reserve Fund. So within our operating budget, you will see a contribution from the City Building Fund Reserve Fund that nets out some of our debt servicing costs. So you will see included in this year's budget is the continuation of a draw from the City Building Fund to be able to offset debt servicing costs. You will also see an increase in that amount. That's not necessarily through intentional actions. It's what's happening because of the increased level of investment that we're making through projects funded from the City Building Fund itself.
All right, but the projects funded through the City Building Fund are the projects that the City Building Fund is intending to fund, but we haven't dipped into this fund for any other related items in this budget, like the TTC or anything else.
Just to ensure complete clarity, we do use the reserve fund to service debt associated with TTC capital investments and housing capital investments. So it is leveraged. That is not unique to the 2026 budget process. We are drawing funds from the reserve, and you will see an increase in the amount we're drawing, driven by the level of investments that we make in capital infrastructure in TTC and housing this year.
Okay. All right, thank you. Just wanted that clarified. So it's always exciting when we can find some efficiencies, and I believe you indicated that you found through this process about $57 million in efficiencies. Was that the number I heard?
To the chair, yes, that's correct.
And so that would equate to a 0.003% savings. Did I do the math correctly?
I can get back to you on that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's over 1%. So every 1% property tax generates 50 million. So if you were to look at it in terms of what it would represent in terms of a tax increase, it would be greater than a 1% increase in the property tax.
So say again, what's greater than 1% increase in the property tax?
So every 1% increase in the property tax generates about $50 million in revenue. So with the level of savings that have been identified, the level of reductions through efficiencies, which was $57 million, it would be greater than a 1%, the equivalent of a 1% tax rate increase.
Equivalent to a 1% tax increase. Okay. Some would argue that it's great that we have these savings, but on a $19 billion budget.
This will be last question, Councillor Crisanti.
Thank you. On a $19 billion budget, how is it that we can't find at least a 1% savings, which could be equivalent to over 200 or just under $200 billion? Have you looked at
Mr. CFO, I think maybe you want to highlight that there's two parts. There's the 57 and the 78. That I think he might be interested in that line by line $78 million number as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and to the chair, so in total, what you will see in this budget is $788 million in total reductions in offsets. There was also an additional $193 million that was found through financing adjustments and then temporary bridging strategies. I'd also like to point, if we look just at reductions in offsets, that $788 million, this is a continuation of actions that we've taken since the onset of the long-term financial plan. If I were to look at the last 3 years alone, and I will caution some of these actions you may have repeated one year and deferred again in the following year, so it's not quite appropriate to add them all together, but it would combine to over $2 billion that we've identified combined over the last three budget process. And there's been quite a bit of effort made across the city and on the heels of the long-term financial plan to continue to find and drive both efficiencies as well as other opportunities for reductions.
Thank you, Chair. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Crisanti. Councillor Fletcher, questions?
Oh, thank you very much. Just on the question about the city building levy, just had an exchange with Councillor Carroll, and we remember that was brought in by the Rob Ford when he was mayor as the Scarborough Subway levy. And then I believe it transitioned to a larger transit levy and now it's a housing levy. That's how I've always understood that as a continuum, and I think it started about 12 years ago.
To the chair, there was a continuum. They were considered separate levies, but it initiated with the Scarborough Transit levy, and on the heels of the Scarborough Transit levy, then began the city building fund itself.
And then council agreed to establish a city building fund, but that was the first time we had a special fund, and it was initiated under the Ford administration in order to get extra funds for big capital issues.
To my knowledge, that would have been the first special levy that I've been aware of here in the city. Yeah,
we were here, so we remember that. We were at the table.
So was I.
It was for the Scarborough Subway when we decided to do that rather than the LRT. I just see on page 23, you're talking about the spend rate, which is great. I'm sure somewhere in here, through all the city divisions, you have the completion rate, the capital completion rate. You're going to know what that was year over year. And then I'm wondering about the capital completion rates for our agencies and corporations, how that oversight is undertaken.
To the chair, yeah. So we've made considerable advancements in our capital spend rates. If I go back even 5 years ago, I believe we were in the mid 60% in total capital completion on the spend rate. We have now, our latest projection is that both between city divisions and our agencies, at Q3, we're projecting to be above 80%, slightly above 80%. And that isn't just in a percentage completion rate, that's actually in total dollars spent as well.
But you could go division by division. You could tell us in certain divisions, here's the spend rate.
Absolutely, and it's also available in the quarterly variance reports.
That's fine, but when we're doing the budget, that would be good to know. In your page 23, state of good repair, you've got potholes in there as something important. Is there a utility reserve that all the utilities pay into? Enbridge, everybody that rips up the pavement, there must be somewhere where all those dollars go. Where would they live?
To the chair, that may be better suited when transportation services is here next week, but there is, I believe, the pavement degradation fee that would go into a reserve and would be leveraged for capital
And we
spending.
would know what that is because that is state of good repair for roads, because I see transportation's mentioned there, so I think you should know I'm going to dig into that one fairly significantly. And then the noting that 3.5 billion, the city is putting by foregone revenue, 3.5 billion into building affordable housing, right? That's quite a significant amount.
So in addition to the direct funding that we provide to various housing initiatives, there is an additional $3.5 billion in foregone revenues that we as a city provide to incentivize housing development.
That's very different, and that's a big step forward in order to make sure it's happening. I'm just noting that on that list, there's only one that's foregone revenue, where we're contributing such a large amount from foregone revenue. And then page 29 for the arena upgrades, rinks and arenas, and you might tell me it's better done when we get to parks, but I'm not sure. I'm looking at all the arenas. Are those all of the arenas, the ones that are directly operated, as well as the ones that have a board of management, or are they, what are the 27?
Probably better served for next week, and we can get into the program details with park staff.
We'll make sure they have.
Make sure that, but I don't believe that, do parks oversee all of the board of management arenas? Yeah, can you just hold that time, Councillor Wall?
Okay, I will, but we are getting into detail well beyond the presentation, and we are behind schedule.
I certainly have it. I'm just
So
interested.
the answer is yes, we do.
So it's parks that has that in their bailiwick. Okay. And then that's fine, because I'll ask about that more. And just on page 29 as well, $8.2 billion wastewater, including treatment plants, sewer rehab and rehabilitation, and then $5.5 billion for stormwater management. Is that mostly basement flooding, or is that also related to sewer and rehab?
To the chair, that would be all of the stormwater initiatives, including direct basement flooding, as well as some of the very large-scale water main projects that contribute to the benefit for stormwater.
So we really are at $13 billion for Toronto Water for people.
I believe
clean
we're
water
higher
is-
than $13 billion in
Pardon me?
total. The total for Toronto Water capital investments
Oh, I'm just looking at page 29. This is-
18.7. Those are just highlights. They're at
Yes.
18.7 billion.
Okay. Wow, thank you very much. Clean water in Toronto. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to bring it into committee. That is it for the non-members. Let me just number off. Starting with our newest member, Councillor Myers. You're going to have questions.
Yes, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, Councillors Morley and Moyse. Councillor Moyse has questions. Councillor Morley, will you have questions?
I'll save mine for next week. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay.
All good.
Thank you so much. Given the time, Councillor Chang has some questions. Councillor Perks, Mr. Vice Chair, will you have questions today? He's saving the good stuff for the detailed review.
GMs. Bring me some GMs.
Call those GMs to the carpet. Okay, Councillor Myers, go ahead.
Thank you. So just quickly, I see on page 36, there's a 3.75% increase of solid waste management service rates and fees. Did the upload of the recycling to the province have any effect on that fee? And what was that impact?
To the chair. So again, I think solid waste staff could probably speak to it better than I can, but at a very high level, that change had been foreseen. So as we do modeling, as we do with all of our rate programs, we do 10-year modeling based on what the expected costs are, what savings might be, pressure demands on the system, and we develop for both Toronto Water and solid waste rate models in terms of what are the annual rate increases needed to be able to address their needs. So as that was being brought forward, savings were expected and were built into the model, and what had been identified for a few years now is annual 3.75% rate increases to be able to satisfy their needs regardless of which year that change was going to come into play.
Thank you. And I guess my next question is, Paul gave some great stats on the work that had been done with encampments, refugees, and moving unhoused into permanent housing. Has this had a material impact on the overall SSHA budget, or is it roughly the same as it was last year, or is it increased?
So no, you'll see that the Toronto shelter budget is a dramatic reduction this year. In fact, over $100 million less. And the big piece of that is that, as I mentioned, the refugee size within our shelter system is down by over 3,000 at the current state. It's about 3,100. At its peak, it was about 6,500. And then the other piece is we continue to move people through. So our shelter system overall is around 9,200 at the moment. It was up to about 12,500. We're using that as a way also from a cost-saving perspective to get out of the most expensive ways of sheltering, which are typically our shelter hotels, and that is saving us money. And in addition, there's been some great work on contract management by the shelter folks to where they have to remain in leased spaces. They're actually getting a better deal. That came out much in 2025. So it's a combination of things, and you'll actually see in their specific budget that year over year, it's a dramatic reduction. Why we put it in as it's still an issue is we continue still to have a dramatically larger shelter system per capita than any other Ontario municipality. So we continue to say there needs to be a better deal for Toronto in terms of how we deal with homelessness, but in terms of how we're managing it ourselves, you see a big change in a positive direction this year.
Thank you. And just one more question. I don't know if this is a next week question, but when we passed the luxury home tax, I think council also said they wanted it focused on transit and housing. Do you have a rough breakdown of where that money went in terms of those two pots?
So we can definitely get back in terms of that rough breakdown, but what you do see is that generated, I believe, around $13 or $14 million, and I'm sure as you're aware, there were significant increases in funding being made within transit initiatives. And essentially that increase enabled us to be able to come forward, or enabled us at least a portion of some of those additional costs that you're seeing in transit and housing initiatives consistent with that direction.
Great. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay, thank you. Councillor Moyse, you had some questions.
Madam Speaker, I'm actually going to hold my questions till next week.
Okay. They're a little more detailed? Okay. Will do. That leaves Councillor Chang.
Thank you. Through the chair, with regard to the $323 million that is coming from temporary bridging measures, and you stated that there would be an equivalent pressure in 2027. So I'm just wondering, what are we bracing ourselves for with regard to 2027, or is there a projected increase that we think we might need to, is this a year of relief that will lead to further pressures next year? What are we planning here?
To the chair, so as we develop this budget, and it's similar with how we've been developing budgets really since 2024, we take an enhanced multi-year view. When we look at 2027, we've identified our outlook. At this point in time, and I want to be very careful, it is January 8th, 2026. We are expecting an opening budget pressure for 2027 of $1.12 billion. As we saw this year, things change. This year, there were significant changes as related to ASC and a couple of other changes that increased the pressure. If I look at where our pressure landed, it was over $1.3 billion. So through some of the actions that we've been taking, and especially around some of the reductions and offset actions that we've taken, we are seeing an ability to essentially maintain that pressure we've seen, even a slight decrease based on the inflated rate. But affordability was an important lens in this year's budget. And with that, there was a trade-off. And one of the trade-offs was some of the gains that we had seen in reducing the opening pressure that you would have seen in prior years. But you're not necessarily seeing any significant upgrade. It just means as hard as this budget process was, next year's will be equally challenging.
And with regard to the New Deal discussions, you had mentioned that there is the development charge chasm that awaits us that will be a focus. Will there also be a focus on discussions of revenue tools that do grow with our economy that can address the structural deficit to our operating budget?
Short answer is yes. It's always been our position that one of the more straightforward ways for us to have a long-term where we don't have to keep coming back, whether it's every year or every 3 years, it really doesn't matter. This constant churn of having to go back and have this discussion is in no one's interest, including the provinces. It'd just be better to solve it. The straightest path is to figure out ways that we can have predictable revenue streams that we can model as they grow with the economy. That said, there are many ways to get to where we need to do. It could be dedicated funding that has a cost of living increase included in it, or some way of making sure that it grows. What can't happen is, in my humble opinion, is this constant, well, we have to go back to the trough. So where you talk about our opening pressure next year in terms of what we've done, think about what it might be should it be, well, there is nothing more. I mean, our budget right now includes close to $600 million in the operating side alone. That is part of the provincial New Deal. And those are to critical services like shelters. They are critical services like transit. So what would we do if those weren't available to us? So there are many routes to get there. The bottom line is in 2026, we need to get there. But we continue, to your direct question, we continue to talk about what you've suggested as one very strong pathway.
So this year, many people are going to feel relief because the last few years have created a lot of pressure, and I'm sure many Torontonians are going to be grateful to hear of this proposed increase. The concern would be that people take that amount and think, wow, the city did it, they can keep doing it, and we can keep drawing from reserves, we can keep finding ways to reduce the pressure. So what is our message to Torontonians that we have intentionally created this situation where we are decreasing the pressure on our residents, but what is the overall message in terms of the fiscal framework of the city and the financial sustainability of our operating budget?
So I'll begin by saying the message is this is still a work in progress as we work towards sustainability. Let's remember that always it was our position when the long-term financial plan came out that there was going to be a heavier tax burden for Torontonians in the early parts of this simply to deal with the pressures coming out of the pandemic. Otherwise, we were in the situation of reducing critical service. There's only two ways you can solve this. So we're on that track. We've never known year to year what the exact number is. That's a relationship that exists with direction from the mayor and priorities of council and all the rest. So we are on the path that we said we were on. We were always going to be in a declining way, and that's what's happened in 24, 25, and now 26. The key piece is, though, that if we don't change some of the fundamentals, we only have two choices, and that is to look at reducing our expenses, which is talking about our services, or to increase revenues. And if those don't come from other places, they will have to come from Torontonians. So I think our message is, I do want to send that it's positive because our plan is working, but it is not solved. And that is where I think the collective effort of yourselves and working with us in terms of how we make the numbers all come together in a gigantic budget, our work together to say that we can get there. We've shown a pathway. I think the capital side is a little bit of a deeper breath moment, but I actually believe on the operating budget side, we've shown a pathway of how we can get to where we need to be with a true partnership of the province and the federal government working with the City of Toronto. And we've already proven what can happen in a good way. And so I think the message again to Torontonians is let's get to that place, because then we do believe, and we've stated from the beginning, that you would see property tax increases that would be far more in the range of what has been expected by Torontonians from a historical perspective since amalgamation.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Cheng, and thank you, Mr. City Manager, for that answer. I only have one quick question. I think questions have been highlighted. We have all the deputy city managers here, and so you've heard some questions that we're punting to the detailed review. But while we don't, as we used to do in years past, we'd have every general manager come and listen for those questions. They're listening offline, and their deputy city managers are here. I only have one question. I want to thank Councillor Chang for using the word draw. Talk to me about reserve draws. But what the word we've been hearing since last night is raid. Now, in my accounting world, in the pencil world, when I hear raid means going into a reserve to serve a purpose for which that reserve was not accumulated in the first place. Are there any reserves that we are using not for their intended purpose, but for some other purpose? Or are we using them for the very reason we accumulated them in the first place?
To the chair, so when we look at the total reserve draws this year, there is an increase from the prior year. Some of that is actually explained through some anomalies. A large part of it is just a timing difference between federal funding that comes in under a different fiscal year. We place the funds in a reserve and then they come out and it looks like a big increase in the amount of draw. We also have
and that's the quantum, but that reserve was put there in the first place to deal with exactly that situation.
Yes, for the intended use. You might also see, again, unique change this year where we had been setting funds aside to our reserve for the World Cup. And you're now seeing a draw from that reserve. So there are some anomalies, even in an election year. Every 3 years we contribute to the election reserve and we draw from it to help perform the election function. So you see a few anomalies that are driving the total amount of reserves that are coming up. Beyond that, within our base budget, we are using reserves as we traditionally use them. Where we look at our budget bridging actions, the one difference this year that I will note is we leveraged the budget bridging reserve in prior budgets as part of our budget bridging actions. We didn't necessarily have the same level of available funds in that reserve. So what we did was there was a comprehensive review done by financial planning across all of our reserves to look at where there was underutilization or inactivity. That was brought forward to council last month, and council approved our ability to leverage those funds into the budget bridging reserve for use today.
Right. So they went into a reserve that is exactly for this, and they are now being used for exactly that. And that's the case, generally speaking, across the board. We reserved in advance of all of the collective bargaining that took place in 2025. The drawdown is because we then, cushion the impact by using that reserve. Basically, we're keeping to our reserve policies, and there's no meaningful change to what we accumulate and how we use it. The quantum goes up and down depending on the need.
Yeah, outside of those actions that we took where there was some capacity or unutilization, we brought forward a few changes. Generally, what you see is the total amount of bridging strategies you see in this year's budget, while different sources, is relatively on par with what you would have seen in the prior year.
Excellent. Okay. And then the rest members will see when the analyst notes, we hope by the end of the business day are out there. Spending rate that Councillor Fletcher highlighted is in there. There's a tendency always to flip to this year, but it's worth reading 2025 to see that achievement, the capital spending rate. Things like reserve draws are in their specific places because sometimes they're accumulated in a department. A lot of the things that people have been talking about since last night are in those analyst notes. If people are having trouble figuring out how to walk through them, this is what Councillor Thompson said, some of us have been walking through them for 23 years. So people need help to figure out what page. We're here to help. That being said, I'm going to leave it at that because the next most important part is a technical briefing for members of the media. And I know they're chomping at the bit to have that. So we have one other item of business, and that's item number 2 is we have to adopt, receive the presentation. Okay. I was going to move the motions all as a package, but let's do item number 1 first. We have to move a motion to receive the presentation. Councillor Chang, did you want to move that motion? Okay, all in favor of receiving that presentation that took us, I'm not even going to mention the time. I'm going to needle him about it later offline. and then I'm going to move to item number 2. Oh yeah, carried, yes, sorry. Matthew's keeping me to the letter of the law here. Okay, item number 2, if you've had a chance to read it, is the striking of those subcommittees that will go out to hear the deputations in the 4 civic centres. I hope folks have already reviewed them so we can consider them read and adopt them. Okay. Councillor Myers, would you like to move that? It'll be your first budget minute. Councillor Myers is moving item number 2, the committees as presented. I see Deputy Mayor Morley. There's too many M's in this committee now. Did you notice that? Deputy Mayor Morley and Moise and the rest of members, that item is carried. And then I just need my favorite motion, the motion to adjourn. They don't let us move it anymore. Thank you all. Thank you, staff. We will see you all a lot next week.